Thank you very much. Very happy to be here. My name is Abby, as Carla just said. And
I'm Mauricio.
And we're going to be talking about when platforms meet app developers.
There you go. I'm playing the app developer.
Exactly. So we're coming from two angles of this, and that comes from actually our positions as co-leads of different working groups within the CNCF. So we are both co-leads of a working group under Tag App Delivery. So the tags in the CNCF are groups that are meant to support the community on specific areas. And so app delivery is taking code from your laptop into production and that whole process. So I'm a co-lead of the platforms working group, and we've put out white papers about platforms and about how to evaluate your maturity as a platform engineering team and organization. We have some work now around platform as a product, and we meet up every 2 weeks, and everyone is welcome to join us.
Yeah, and I'm a co-lead at the Application Development Working Group. So in this working group, we are more focused on helping application developers to get closer to the cloud-native space. You will see during this presentation that this is a lot about this specific topic on how developers use the technology that we usually discuss in these events and how we can make their experience a little bit better. We also meet every 2 weeks, and we are looking for more people to join. And I would love to ask, how many developers, full-time developers, do we have here in the room? OK, so we have some. That's really good. And I encourage you to take a look at the link, but also join the meetings, because actually what we are building there, what we are trying to create there in this more newer working group is to get more developers closer to this space. I wrote a blog post about mostly the developer aspects of this presentation. It's there, the link in the slides. And I will probably share that in Twitter later on as well. But if you're interested in these topics, please check it out.
Awesome. And so...
we have been going to KubeCons for at least the last 3-4 years consistently. And we usually go and attend and present at the platform engineering track. If you take a look at the presentations that you always see in these tracks, and I'm pretty sure that in Salt Lake City it will be pretty similar, and next year in London, I think that the track is evolving, but the topics are pretty consistent. So if you look into what presentations are there, you will see that there are presentations about observability, building platforms, GitOps, provisioning infrastructure is a very strong topic in this track. And lately, in the last 2 years and a half, we have been seeing a lot about backstage and internal developer platforms and portals, even with creating more consolidation between the tools and putting tools together just to cover certain use cases, like Backstage, Argo, Crossplane, and Kyverno, becoming some sort of stack that people use to solve some very, very common use cases in that space.
Yeah, as a platform engineer, I think that's pretty common. I've seen that a lot. Is that helpful to you in your app developer space for users?
I really like these tools, but if you start talking to developers, none of these tools are actually targeting developers per se. They might help to enable some of the developer needs, but actually, they are pretty far from developers. None of these tools have the developer persona defined as a target user. And maybe we need to do something about it, right?
Yeah. What do you need?
Yeah, OK. So let's imagine that we are working for a financial organization. It's a large organization. Let's say you work for a bank. And this bank will have tons of different services, right? Probably you as a developer, you are not in charge of understanding all the context on all the services that are inside the bank, but you kind of get an idea. There is some money somewhere, there are some customers that you need to attend, and then you need to change these services to make the service that the bank offers a little bit better. As a developer, you will be targeting probably a couple of services, 3, 4, 5 services, and you will need to spend some time understanding the context of how these services works. You will need to understand which tools have been used to build these services, to run them, and also understand the process of changing these services so you can make changes, and then those changes can be deployed in front of your customers. That's not an easy job for someone who is new to this context, so they will need to spend some time learning about it.
It's fine. Platform engineering, I'm a platform engineer, I can help. I know what to do. I can help you deploy a kind cluster, Kubernetes and Docker. It'll be on your local machine, and that will really help you be able to test the two services together. It'll be a really effective setup. It's really simple, actually. It's 2 commands, kind create cluster. You get your cluster locally, and then you can deploy your applications onto it. And then it is your ecosystem. You can do anything and everything you want, including debugging the services and understanding how they work. It's great. Is that good for you?
I think that I've seen that solution before, and I would love to ask how many people is doing something like that. Kind clusters for local development. OK, we see a few hands. It's a good number for this audience. That's good.
But
maybe yes, maybe no. It really depends on the maturity of the organization. So yeah.
Yeah, I guess if I'm being honest, as a platform engineer, it is sort of the easy solution for me, right? As a platform engineer, I hang out in the CNCF, I hang out in tech, I hang out in Kubernetes. So to give you Kubernetes is like in my ballpark, in my area of expertise. So I can hand this out, I see solutions around this all the time, tons of blog posts and talks about it, and I can manage it really easy because, well, I'm giving it to you. Right? So I don't actually have to do all that much. I just have to lean on the community and these fantastic Kubernetes-based tools. So to be fair, if I'm being honest, it is that. And if I want to be a more effective support for you, a more effective platform for you, I have to challenge myself a bit. I have a couple things I need to kind of develop in my own personal skills as a team and as an org. First of all, I need to understand the problem space a bit better. I need to stop thinking about what tools I have to give to you and think about what problems you need to solve so that I can then come around to what tools will solve it. That's not the easiest thing to do. The second thing I need to do is I need to think about how to deliver those solutions in a way that is maintainable and extensible. So I need to have a software delivery mindset, even though my background is often coming from a more opsy, cloud opsy, infra kind of space. And so these kinds of things are going to challenge me, which is why I maybe lean towards some of the solutions that are more in my wheelhouse.
And that makes total sense, right? Like if I need to rephrase point 1 and point 2, I would call the first one, talk to your developers. Like you can just talk to your teams and understand what they are doing. And for the second one is, again, talk to your developers because they know how to deliver software, right? Like they know how to change, they know practices, they know best practices and patterns and architectural patterns to create scalable solutions. So let's do that.
So I guess first step is talk to your developers. So Mauricio, what do you need?
I have 3 things in mind, and we will discover like 3 different things that developers always complain when they are building kind of like complex solutions with a complex technology stack. The first thing is support on the inner loop. Right? Like developers will build software in their computers most of the time, and they will have a bunch of tools that they will depend on in order to build their services and test their services and actually make changes there. I would say that like if you go into the bank, it's quite common to find Java. Like this applies to any language, but you will have a runtime. Depending on the company, you will be allowed to use Docker or not in your workstation. And then, depending on where you have your source code, probably having the Git CLI just to clone all that stuff into your computer. Once you have that, then understanding the services, the code, and how do you fetch dependencies from different places becomes also an important aspect. But then finally, something that I've seen kind of like quite a lot is like the dependency on application infrastructure, which is databases, message brokers. That nowadays, most developers will just have a Docker Compose file that they can start, and then they just will connect to that in order to make changes and test whatever they are trying to make there. This includes the dependency on some infrastructure like artifact repositories for dependencies and a container registry just to pull some container images to bootstrap application infrastructure. So understanding some of these basic things that developers are doing makes me think that platform engineering can start helping us with some of these aspects, right?
Yeah, with Kubernetes.
If you add Kubernetes to the picture, things becomes a little bit more and more complicated, right? Like it doesn't really matter if it's running on a remote cluster or in the local environment, as Avi suggested with the kind cluster. But the fact that now developers needs more tool, right? Like more tools, like kubectl might be the easiest example to think, but Helm if you're deploying charts. And then how the applications are going to connect to that infrastructure in that new environment is kind of like, it's a big question. And if you start looking into banks and large organizations, you will see that training every developer to understand how to interact with the Kubernetes cluster and how Kubernetes behaves, it's quite like a big endeavor. So, not every company is there.
All right, so I'm going to exercise my problem solution brain here and try and relay back what I'm hearing. What I'm hearing is there's sort of this category of challenges that you have, which includes sort of how humans interact with your software. So how do people onboard into your team and into your software? If someone wanted to get started with developing new within your services, how does that work? Yep. But even those that aren't new, it's not about team changeover and things like that. It's about just being able to use your software and debug it locally and have that debugging actually have relevance to what's going on in your production environments and your CI environments and all that, because having the right setup and having all the right versions of things. And this isn't just versions of the applications that are running, it's versions of the applications you're using.
Yeah.
So are you using the right version of Postgres for your database? Are you using the right version of CLI tools that you depend on?
Yeah.
These are things that can create it works on my machine, commentary and culture, which can be a really dangerous setup for teams to get past. So that's sort of the challenges. But I feel like software's been being created for a long time. You're kind of working through these problems. As an app developer, what are you doing right now to sort of...
So I've been looking to...
Summarize, sorry, I forgot my summary slide. Summarize is local environments, they are feeling unreproducible and they're feeling complex. So that's all that setup of new team members and things. But as I say, you're sort of doing things.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, right? Like there are tools for solving these problems. Companies are actually solving these problems. So I've been looking into a couple of things here, like completely different tools. How many people here in the audience knows about Nixos? Okay, we have people knowing about this. This is a package manager that basically focuses on providing high reproducible set of tools put together, down to the bit, like the last bit. So they will check exactly that you have exactly the same versions. It's a pretty hardcore tool to start working with because it requires you to basically have every dependency managed by that package manager. So there is a tool called DevBox, which is basically focused on providing development environments using Nixos as a package manager. And having that like developer experience, like simplified experience on top of a very complex package manager, it's super nice. And on the other side, what you have is DevPod, is something created by Love Labs. I think that they are sponsoring this event. It's more on the container side of things, right? Like you can create containerized development environments that you can run locally in your machine or in the cloud, which is also very interesting. And they also integrate with tools that developers usually use, like IDEs, so they can provision like very complex development environments on the cloud that you can run locally or remote. The important part of these two things is that they both uses something that is called dev containers, which is a specification to define development environments. The specification was created by Microsoft, and I think it's using by code spaces as well. So it's kind of interesting to see these shared contracts to define a common, very, very common requirement. So if you haven't checked this, please take a look.
Well, it's often not tools that I talk about in the platform engineering space. It actually fits really well with some of the principles I think about from platform engineering, right? Is that we're thinking about creating contracts between users and producers, between the platform and the app devs. And what you're just saying is that contract can extend beyond things like centralized servers and actually reach into those local environments and provide those contracts there as well, which is great.
I feel that the cloud native platform engineering topics are evolving into a certain level of maturity where we can just go out and now just get closer to developers in this case.
All right. I like this. Talk to me more. What else is there?
Let's go to the second one, right? Like we talk about the inner loop, the tools that you need to work on your changes as a developer. Let's talk a little bit about the outer loop. Developers will always complain. I push my changes, it takes 3 hours in order to be validated by the CI pipeline, and then something fails like formatting of my code, and I need to push again and wait for 3 hours for my changes to be validated or to be pushed into a new environment where I can validate the changes. That's kind of like a big problem, right? Because there is something wrong in there.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely lived this life. I know this category of pain, right? That idea, you talk about pushing changes to that central repository. Most of us are using Git at this point, and what we're seeing in CI and CD pipelines is it can take hours to get those tests completed. And so people sort of forget that they even pushed, let alone to track those things. Sometimes you're even queuing to get into environments when they're shared and there's a lot of changes going in, and that can take a long time. Yeah. There's also, so we start pushing that left, right? Shift left. And we start giving things like kind clusters and more higher level environments on your local machines, but that involves huge time spans locally now because you have to build containers, you have to load them into your clusters, you have to do all these things. So you're still sort of losing your track of development if you're using those kinds of processes.
And let's be honest, right? Like if you're a developer, you are pushing something and you need to wait on CI, you are going to wait on CI. You are not going to start working on a second issue. You just need to wait on CI to validate one first.
It's a new GitHub, waiting on GitHub, playing with the swords. And then finally, and this is the most frustrating thing, is if you have different behaviors in CI and locally, how are you even going to debug that? So now you've waited hours to get feedback, and you now don't know why it's failed, and you've got to wait more hours because the only way to find out is to try again, right? So what we're talking about here is that slow feedback loops are a huge detriment to software engineering today.
Exactly, yeah.
So what can we do?
So again, there are tools for solving, and I'm pretty sure that you're already using a CI tool, and that makes total sense. I believe that platform engineers can start looking into how these CI tools are being used based on what the technology that developers are using, how to improve those pipelines is always a good start. Taking metrics is also important. If you look at some tools that are being used nowadays, like GitHub Actions is pretty common. And I think that it gains a lot of popularity because it actually has a lot of pre-made tasks that developers or operation people can use to create their pipelines. So most of the steps that you're going to be executing are already pre-made. That saves you a lot of time. But if you are like working in a bank, for example, like you're not going to run in the cloud. So you might need some local runners or even use some tools to run these GitHub Actions in your local machine. There are some projects that will allow you to do that. They are not perfect, but I think that it's possible. And also, like in this corner, basically it says YAML definitions that will push developers or anyone in charge of changing these to learn the syntax. And of course, that you can learn that, but it will take some time. The other side of the diagram, you have Dagger, which is a much more newer project created by the ex-Docker founders. And basically what they do is they created this pipeline engine that can run in the same way in every environment. So the idea here is that you can run the same things that you will run in GitHub Actions in your local computer before pushing the code into the source control repository. But what I like as a developer is that they provide SDKs in the languages that I know, so I can create the pipelines and the tasks that I want to share with other teams in a language that I can manage and I can change and I can test. And I think that's a pretty interesting advantage. So if you haven't checked it out,
yeah, now you're talking CI pipelines. This is coming closer to the world of platform engineering today and what you kind of see people talking about. But what you're talking about here with these specific projects and the values you see in them is that there are modular contracts that these tools provide. They allow you to compose higher value things, higher value like releases, by pulling in pieces, which gives you that ability to get higher value and share across the organization, reduce duplication of effort. But it also gives you that flexibility of environment, that the modularity of it means you can run these in different places. And that makes for a very big difference on that whole it works on my machine piece.
Yeah, exactly. Like in this case, like you will be running the same code, let's say, remotely for your pipelines and locally for your developers.
Amazing. You had one more complaint, right?
One more, and okay. we are just we are running out of time, so I will just go fast. I think that like another thing that I see developers like, complaining a lot is about how do they share things between teams, right? Like, and this becomes kind of like a big problem in distributed systems. If you have shared dependencies across different services and across different teams, they need to keep all these shared dependencies in sync. And helping developers with this specific problem, I think that it's pretty important. These shared dependencies usually will include some stuff like, cross-cutting concerns like retry mechanisms, circuit breakers, libraries to connect to like an authentication server, logging and observability, and configuration for the services. That's kind of like one side, and usually what people does, like developers will have like a shared library that they will use in every service that they will need to distribute, probably placing that into an artifact repository. Other type of dependencies are more like connectors to infrastructure, like database drivers or message broker clients or configuration and secret clients to connect to external services, like, for example, the cloud provider SDKs, where you are going to connect your services to. So it's a complicated problem. It
is a complicated problem. There's like a whole category of problems actually in there, which is around like how does an app developer think about making their service relevant to the business requirements? So resiliency, observability, things like that. Who's in charge of what that looks like at an organization of scale?
And I think that some of that has been covered by the platform space, right? Like there are some things that the platform teams or even the people responsible to create environments where the applications will run, sometimes they take care of some of these things. And there needs to be a contract about that.
You're still asking for more.
I want more, yes.
Always want more of those app devs.
Yeah.
Users. We also talk, though, about something that maybe is a little bit more outside platform, which is around like data structure. So when you're looking at like logging or even like domain databases, who defines those structures? How do you define what are required aspects of those? So how do you mention a user ID, and how do you keep consistency of your keys? What's recommended styles for doing that? Where are you allowed to go kind of bespoke and unique to your business or to your service? And how do you even know what's going on around your organization? Is there a library to help you out? Does that exist? Are you allowed to use third-party libraries? Is that part of the security posture of your company? And if you do need a library, how do you identify that it needs to be created, or how do you get involved in creating one and sharing it across your organization? These are all sort of things that I hear when you're talking about those challenges.
I think that you're 100% right there. Like, these are the problems that people basically face, like developers face.
And people need standardization. So standardization can be a little bit of a potty word in some circles. But the conventions, the practices, these are things that people need to lean on so they can use their creativity for the things that deserve creativity. Some of these things should just be kind of solved and easy.
Exactly.
So how are you doing that today?
Yeah, so I think that we are in the cloud native space, right? So probably how many people here is using Istio or a service mesh? Right, or know what a service mesh is, right? We know what that is. That has been around in the space for a long time. I think that Istio is kind of great, the idea of delegating to the underlying platform, like the runtime in this case of your application, all the resiliency concerns, like retry mechanisms, circuit breakers, MTLS, and security. I think that that's pretty important. We know that. And there is an implicit contract there of, if you have that, if you have Istio capabilities, the application will not take care of this. There are some scenarios where you have libraries in your application for retry mechanisms and libraries and using something like Istio there. If you don't know about Dapper, that's the project that I'm working on nowadays. Basically, Dapper it kind of introduces a different approach here. It exposes APIs to abstract infrastructure. So remember that idea of connecting to infrastructure and that you need clients and drivers and all that stuff. Dapper what does, it provides a proxy that exposes an API, so your application doesn't need to include these shared libraries across different services. They can just interact with the local API that it's running in a sidecar proxy.
And you're singing my platform language now, because what I'm hearing is we're moving past just contracts, and we're talking about APIs.
APIs. Yeah.
Contracts are important, and they're a big part of some of the other challenges that we can solve for application developers. They help us make things explicit and sort of drive implicit behaviors as well. We'll talk about that. But the big thing about APIs is that it hides the implementation details. It allows for the platform to evolve, to change, and the app devs to not have to worry about how something is getting done.
Yeah, and if you think about what application developers are doing most of the time, they are consuming APIs. So if you give them APIs to build their applications, they will pretty much know how to do that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we've just done there is sort of describe a bit of problem discovery here based on our experiences in our working groups and in our working experiences. But we didn't talk about how we got there. It's just basically what we've lived and what we've learned. If you want to learn more, there's been a few talks here today and yesterday with people who are doing this. Go talk to them about how, or check out the upcoming Platform Engineering Day, where there's going to be a lot of product talks. That will all be on YouTube if you don't want to fly over to Salt Lake City and take that out. But we're not going to talk about how, but we've got that problem identified now. So the final kind of part of our talk here today is talk about what happens actually solving these problems in tech. How do we do that in that maintainable, extensible way? And so I want to call attention to the fact we've already talked about projects. We talked about 6 different projects that are being used, and they're being used at scale and with value, because we know that these solutions do exist. But from what we understand and what we've seen and what we do, they're all isolated solutions. They're still in that sort of quote-unquote DevOps phase where each team is solving the problem a bit independently. And they'd get a lot more benefit to organizations of scale with tens and hundreds of teams if they were able to be managed and supported more widely across the organization. And that's what we want to talk about.
I think that's super important, and that's something that we are doing in the application development working group, is we are trying to show the platform working group or other working groups what developers are doing more easily, more explainable, and in a language that they can understand, so we can start tackling these problems together.
It is asking a fair amount, though, right? Like, if we look at, we talked at the very start about what talks we're seeing coming out of platform engineering today. There's also some beliefs that we see being thrown around in most conversations around platform engineering. And I have to be honest, they challenge some of the things that you were asking for, right? So, for example, build for the 80%. Platforms aren't meant to build 100% of the solutions. They're meant to only build 80%. So that doesn't line up. And how about this whole enabling through templates? Like, we heard about templates in 2 of the 3 keynotes this morning. And templates, like how am I going to manage all these things on your laptop with templates? And that seems not possible. And your laptop anyways should be out of scope, right?
Yep.
Platforms are about centralized services. I don't manage all the MacBooks at my company. Like, that's not my job.
Yeah.
And of course, a common one is that Kubernetes is our platform, right? So laptops, again, out of scope and anything else. But so that's starting to challenge those.
So I think that I don't think that we need to per se challenge them, but try to understand how do we close the gaps with developers. So for example, for build for the 80%, it's always the question, how do you enable the other 20% that you're not covering by your default golden paths, let's say. I keep hearing golden paths and all these things, and usually golden paths, they touch developers just towards the end. It's pretty hard to see a golden path that covers the inner loop, for example, which is something that we probably need to do at some point. If you think about enabling through templates, that's something that gets really under my skin, because as a developer, I usually not create new services, so I don't need to bootstrap a whole new thing from a template. That the moment that I start touching it, then I need to own responsibility of, and then there is no contract about who upgrades the template or who can manage that future versions of the template. Or if as a developer, I need to keep my application updated to follow what the template was doing, right? Platforms only provide certain services, central services, right? Yes, how does that relate to the inner loop? If we don't have a clear answer for that, then it becomes very difficult to enable teams of developers that are not Kubernetes savvy. Which takes me to the last point, right? Not everybody is using Kubernetes. Not every developer wants to learn about Kubernetes. If you think about these large financial organizations, they have been doing services for a long time. Changing and adding a whole new set of tools, it's quite complicated. So sometimes we need to take that into consideration.
Sorry, got a little excited on that click. In reality, what we're talking about is that a lot of these things that platform engineering talks about today is reducing the scope of what platforms are going to provide value on. But it's not about technology, it's about business value. We need to be thinking about what we need to provide, not what's easy to provide. And so if we're going to reduce our scope, let's at least make clear where we end today and where we maybe want to get to in the future. And one way that we can clarify scope is through using APIs, which can help us define our ownership models and clarify who has ownership of what. For example, the contract of your API, what you can request from an API and with what values and what your validations are, this is what defines the explicit opportunities and options from that API. But what you define explicitly also drives implicit outcomes. For example, if you allow people to set a version of something when they request it from the platform, you're telling them, and that's your business now. Mm-hmm. You're in charge of that version. So if that version has a security flaw in it, you're in charge of upgrading it. Mm-hmm. If you don't expose version in that explicit contract, what you're saying is, I got you. I'll make sure that this version stays up to date. I'll make sure that it gets upgraded and updated, right? You're creating contracts with people, and we need to be aware of the explicit and implicit outcomes of that. And in addition, both of us, you can come and talk to us. We love Helm and Terraform are fantastic, and all these other infrastructure tools, but they are code contracts. And code contracts are not the same thing as API contracts. Mm-hmm. APIs truly decouple the producer and the consumer, and it makes a complete difference from handing someone something they have to learn a new language in versus handing them the outcomes that they're looking for. And so set those scopes, be clear about ownership through APIs.
I think that APIs are usually the answer for our presentation. So I think that, so if you look at what can you do to alleviate some of the application development pain, it's focus on APIs. Give users, give developers APIs so they can do their work by consuming APIs that they already know how to do so. Most of the APIs will automatically have documentation. Again, you don't need to write tons of different user manuals on how to consume these services from your platform, because you're giving them APIs. They can consume that out of the way. They will understand what this API is doing and what this API is not doing by just looking at the API contracts. And finally, if you have APIs, again, you will make it much more simple for developers to consume the API, but also to compose more complex functionality across different APIs and building blocks.
And they won't have to know how something works to be able to use it. So it reduces their cognitive load overall. So the key about APIs is that it unleashes both sides. So it allows producers of platforms to actually build with software engineering principles in mind, with iteration and change. So let's talk about what principles you can apply from software engineering to building platforms that I would argue today is in the infant stage of being applied.
Yep.
The first is that platforms need to choose their architecture intentionally. Monorepo microservices. Go to any application developer conference, it will be talked about. It's not inherently good or bad, either of them, but you need to think about what your outcomes need to be in relation to the rate of change, the coupling, the different resiliency requirements. This will define should you use a microservice or a monolithic solution, and that's true for platforms as well. In addition, you have to build confidence with your software. So you need to be able to deliver in a small, fast, and safe way. This is CI/CD. Build confidence through testing, build confidence through rollback strategies that are realistic, roll out and roll back. In addition, this isn't limited to only things that are in your control. Like web apps are easier to do CI/CD on, but we also see this for mobile apps, for desktop apps. This exists in the software world. It can be applied to platform world, including to the local developer environment.
100%.
Finally, we need to think about cross-functional requirements as we build. We need to think about that user experience of onboarding, that user experience of maintenance, that overall cognitive load of using the platform. This makes a really big difference because what you're looking for is being able to have speed to market so that you can capture the opportunity when people tell you where pain lives, and you can reduce the risk when you have things like zero-day incidents and things like that that you need to roll out.
I think that Carla is going to kick us out of this
No.
scenario. So I would say that the main takeaway from this presentation is talk to your developers, join the application development working group if you are working on platforms. And I think that that's pretty much it. You can say the last.
I always get the last word with you,
Take
right?
the last word. There you go.
Yeah, just making sure the communication between both sides, because platforms can learn a lot from app devs and vice versa. So really supercharge your platform engineering outcomes by having those conversations across and thinking about how you can learn from each other in lots of different ways. Thank you.
Thank you.